And Maryland Democratic Senator Ben Cardin has waded into the situation in Hong Kong, now threatening China with, quote, profound consequences, including sanctions, if the Chinese government came down on the Hong Kong protesters with a heavy hand. Cardin made the case that a 1992 U.S. law affords Hong Kong special treatment in matters of trade and other economic affairs separate than mainland China with respect to the one country, two systems policy when Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997. So joining us now to break it all down, investigative journalist Ben Swan. So Ben, what is your take on an American senator weighing in on this foreign issue? We already know that Beijing has told Ben Cardin to basically butt out.
Yeah, they've told him and other senators as well to butt out. Look, at the end of the day, what Senator Cardin is saying is inaccurate. It's accurate that Hong Kong may be afforded some kind of special distinction in trade and economic issues that has nothing to do with violent protests that are taking place. Not to side with the Chinese here, but this is a domestic issue that's happening in China. It's a Chinese issue, and the U.S. really should have no involvement in it. You see U.S. flags being carried by protesters. We know that there have been meetings between high-level U.S. officials and these protesters. And in Manila, if we take a step back from that and just say, well, what would happen in the United States if there was a group of protesters, I don't know, say in a city maybe in Missouri, like in Ferguson, where people decided to protest and not even shut down an airport. Imagine if they had gone to St. Louis and said, we're shutting down the airport, no one's going to fly in or out of St. Louis. Just protesting down the streets in Ferguson, we saw military vehicles, we saw tear gas fired, we saw people being arrested. But the idea that the Chinese government should have basically a hands-off position when it comes to protesters in their own country, the U.S. should butt out of it. It's none of our business.
Yeah, it's certainly the pot calling the kettle black there, Ben. And as we kind of alluded to, Senator Cardin isn't the only high-profile senator chiming in on this. Yep. Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio, this is bipartisan, obviously, he's been tweeting about it all week, saying actions of the Chinese government against Hong Kong, a cautionary lesson for anyone thinking about any deal with them. They signed a treaty promising autonomy and democracy for Hong Kong. They will agree to anything to get the deal, but have no intention of keeping those promises. A lot of people are now making comparisons to Tiananmen Square now, Ben. What do you make of Marco Rubio and those comparisons, too?
Well, there's a big difference between this and Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was a visual image of one man standing in front of a tank. He was not engaged in violence. He was not setting things on fire. He was not throwing Molotov cocktails and bombs at police officers. He was simply standing in the way of that military vehicle. It was a powerful image. That is not what's happening in Hong Kong right now. There's a fascinating article that was in the Australian today in Australia, and essentially said that no Western nation would ever tolerate what's happening in Hong Kong right now. They would never tolerate protesters throwing bombs or weapons at police officers. That would never happen in this country and be allowed to happen. It would not be allowed to happen to shut down an international airport. It would not take place. And you're telling me that if that happened here in the U.S., there would not be a heavy-handed response, that protesters would not be zip-tied, beaten, and dragged away? It would happen here. So there is an enormous double standard when U.S. politicians start standing up and pointing fingers and saying, you better not do anything about these protesters because it demonstrates that you guys are an oppressive regime, because every other country would do it too.
Yeah, I can't help but laugh because, I mean, you and I have worked together for a very long time. We've both covered Ferguson. We've covered the riots in Baltimore, and we have seen the heavy militarization of not only police, but the deployment of the National Guard for a lot less than what we're seeing in Hong Kong.
And those people, in many cases, are not involved in any act of violence. There are protesters who get beaten and arrested in this country just for marching or for standing on the streets because they don't have a permit to do so, let alone all the other actions that are taking place.
Right. And lastly, Ben, kind of a weird twist to all this. We already mentioned, that Hong Kong was given back to China by the British, in 1997. British MP is also tweeting, because that's what all diplomats and officials do now. They tweet out their policy. They tweet it. He's saying that the British should give Hong Kong residents special British passports. So we know that the British returned Hong Kong to China in 1997. Wouldn't this be in some way going back to the days of yore, essentially reclaiming, the people of Hong Kong as part of the Queen's empire again?
Well, and that's exactly the problem with all of this talk. Yes, absolutely, it would be. It's the UK saying, we want to heavily involve ourselves in what's happening in China. It's not the UK's business. Look, protesters have the right to protest. You and I both believe that. Violence becomes a whole other issue. But at the end of the day, those protesters, if they are sincere and they truly are fighting for a new future, throwing weapons and bombs at police, shutting down airports is not going to accomplish your goal ultimately. But even if you think that's the method, you have to be able to stand on your own. This idea of them marching around with U.S. flags only further creates an incendiary moment. Or a British flag. It shouldn't be happening in that country. Stand on your own, have a vision, and fight for that vision. But by trying to become some kind of Jeffersonian democracy backed by the U.S. or the U.K. only further inflames this idea of the U.S. involving itself in other countries where it should not be.
And the UK trying to go backwards in time to involve themselves again.
Always.
So we will leave it right there as always. That's right. We'll leave it right there.